The year is 1916. The Battle of the Somme is raging across the French countryside, and somewhere in the chaos of mud, barbed wire, and shellfire, a young British private named Albert Herring is about to do something that defies every rule of warfare and human biology. He's going to fight one of the deadliest battles of World War I without ever waking up. Yes, you heard that right. This soldier completed an entire combat mission, saved multiple lives, and returned to his trench all while fast asleep. And before you think this is some kind of legend or tall tale passed around campfires, the military records from 1916 tell us this actually happened, witnessed by dozens of men who swore affidavits about what they saw that night. Now I know what some of you are thinking. How on earth does a person fight a battle while sleeping? Doesn't your body need to be awake to do something that complex? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore together today, because this story takes us deep into the mysteries of the human mind during one of history's most brutal wars. And fair warning, what happened to Albert Herring that night in July 1916 is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about consciousness, survival instinct, and what the human body can accomplish when pushed to its absolute limits. Before we get into that fateful night, you need to understand what life was like for these soldiers. The Somme wasn't just a battle, it was hell on earth. Men lived in trenches filled with water up to their knees. Rats the size of cats fed on the dead bodies in no man's land. The constant bombardment from artillery meant you couldn't hear yourself think. Sleep was almost impossible. When you did manage to drift off for an hour or two, you were still half alert because a German raid could come at any moment. Your mind never fully rested. Your body never fully relaxed. You existed in this strange twilight state between waking and sleeping for weeks at a time. Albert Herring was 23 years old when he arrived at the Somme. He'd grown up in a small village in Yorkshire, the son of a blacksmith. Strong as an ox, quiet as a church mouse. That's how his sergeant described him. He wasn't the type to seek glory or medals. He did his job, kept his head down, and tried not to think too much about the horrors surrounding him every single day. But the conditions were getting to him just like they got to everyone else. After 6 weeks of continuous fighting, Albert hadn't had a proper night's sleep. His hands shook when he tried to eat. His eyes had dark circles that made him look 20 years older, and he'd started doing something that worried his fellow soldiers. He'd started sleepwalking. The first time it happened, his mate Tommy found him standing at the parapet of the trench at 3 in the morning, staring out into no man's land with his rifle in his hands. Tommy called out to him, but Albert didn't respond. When Tommy got closer and shook his shoulder, Albert suddenly jerked awake, completely confused about how he'd gotten there. He had no memory of leaving his dugout or picking up his weapon. The next week it happened again, then again. Each time, someone would find him wandering the trench system in the middle of the night, his eyes open but seeing nothing, moving with this strange automatic precision like a wind-up toy soldier. The medical officer examined him and said it was shell shock combined with severe sleep deprivation. The recommendation was to send Albert back behind the lines for rest, but this was the Somme in 1916. They couldn't spare a single man. The casualties were mounting by the thousands every single day, so the officer did what officers did back then. He told Albert to try to sleep more and sent him back to his unit. It was a death sentence disguised as medical advice, because what happened 3 nights later would prove just how dangerous Albert's condition had become. July 23, 1916, the date that changed Albert Herring's life forever. His unit was holding a section of trench that had been under heavy bombardment for days. The Germans were preparing for a major push. Everyone could feel it. The air had that electric quality that soldiers learned to recognize, that sense that something terrible was about to break loose. Albert's platoon had orders to maintain their position no matter what. Reinforcements were coming but wouldn't arrive until dawn. They just had to hold on through the night. Around 10 that evening, exhausted beyond measure, Albert finally lay down in a small dugout carved into the side of the trench. He was asleep within seconds. His body had simply shut down from exhaustion. But here's where things get strange. At exactly midnight, according to the watch of Corporal James Mitchell, who recorded everything in his diary that night, the German bombardment started. Shells began falling all along the British line. The explosions were so intense that dirt and debris rained down into the trenches. Men scrambled to their positions, grabbing rifles and ammunition, preparing for the infantry assault they knew would follow the barrage. And then Albert appeared. He climbed out of his dugout, grabbed his rifle and bayonet, and took up his position at the firing step. Nothing unusual about that, except for one detail that Corporal Mitchell noticed immediately. Albert's eyes were open but completely blank. He wasn't blinking despite the dust and smoke filling the air. He moved with mechanical precision, checking his weapon, adjusting his equipment, but there was something profoundly wrong about the way he did it. Mitchell later wrote that it was like watching a ghost operate a body, like Albert was there but not there at the same time. Mitchell tried to speak to him, but the bombardment was too loud. Besides, they had bigger problems. Through the smoke and fire, dark shapes began emerging from the German trenches. The infantry assault had begun. Hundreds of German soldiers were charging across no man's land, using the cover of their own artillery to get as close as possible before the guns stopped. This was the moment every soldier dreaded. Hand-to-hand combat in the trenches, the most brutal form of warfare ever invented. The German barrage lifted, and suddenly everything went quiet for just a moment, that eerie silence before the storm. Then the shouting started, German voices getting closer. Mitchell and the other men opened fire, shooting at the advancing shapes in the darkness. Beside him, Albert was firing too, but something was different. Albert wasn't just shooting randomly into the dark like everyone else. He was picking targets with uncanny accuracy. Mitchell watched in amazement as Albert fired, worked the bolt of his rifle, fired again, each shot deliberate and precise. And Albert never once took cover. He stood fully exposed on the firing step while bullets whipped past his head, as if he couldn't perceive the danger he was in. The Germans reached the wire. Some got through. A group of about 8 soldiers jumped down into the British trench about 20 yards from where Albert and Mitchell were positioned. This was it. This was when men fought with bayonets, clubs, entrenching tools, anything they could grab. Mitchell raised his rifle to meet the attack, but before he could fire, Albert was moving. Later, Mitchell would describe it as the most terrifying and impressive thing he'd ever seen. Albert charged at the German soldiers with his bayonet fixed, moving with this fluid, almost graceful motion that seemed impossible in the cramped confines of the trench. He didn't shout, didn't show any emotion. He just moved forward like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance, and yet somehow unstoppable. What happened next is documented in the sworn statements of 4 separate soldiers who all witnessed the same incredible scene. Albert fought hand-to-hand with these German soldiers for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. He used his rifle as both a firearm and a club. He moved in ways trained soldiers weren't supposed to move, reacting to attacks before they came, as if some deeper part of his brain could sense danger without conscious thought. One German soldier lunged at him with a bayonet. Albert sidestepped at the last possible second, a movement so fluid and instinctive that it looked choreographed. Another soldier tried to brain him with an entrenching tool. Albert blocked it with his rifle, spun, and knocked the man unconscious with the butt of his weapon. The other British soldiers rushed to help, and together they drove the Germans back. Several of the enemy soldiers were killed. Others retreated back toward their own lines. And through it all, Albert never stopped, never slowed down, never showed any sign that he registered what was happening. His face remained blank. His eyes remained unfocused. He fought like a machine programmed for survival, every movement efficient and deadly. But the battle wasn't over. The Germans regrouped and came again. This time they brought more men. The fighting spread up and down the trench line. Somewhere in the chaos, a British soldier named William Davies took shrapnel from a grenade and went down, badly wounded. He fell into a shell crater that had partially collapsed one wall of the trench, out of sight of most of the defenders. Davies was bleeding heavily and couldn't move. In the confusion and darkness, no one saw him fall except one person. Albert. Without any apparent thought or hesitation, Albert broke away from the main fight and climbed down into the crater where Davies lay bleeding. German soldiers were still in the trench above them. Bullets were zipping through the air. Explosions continued to rock the ground. And Albert, still in whatever trance state he was in, calmly tore strips from his own uniform and began bandaging Davies' wounds. His movements were sure and steady, showing no sign of panic or fear. Davies later reported that he kept trying to tell Albert to leave him and get back to safety, but Albert never responded, never even looked at his face. He just kept working, tying off the bandages, checking the wounds, doing exactly what military first aid training had taught him to do. Then Albert did something that still gives me chills when I read about it. He picked Davies up, threw him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and climbed back up out of the crater. This was a full-grown man, plus equipment, plus the weight of waterlogged uniforms, probably close to 200 pounds total. Albert carried him through the fighting, through the bullets and the explosions, back to the relative safety of a deeper dugout where the medical orderly could treat him. Then Albert turned around and walked straight back into the battle. The fighting continued for another hour. Eventually, British reinforcements arrived and the Germans were pushed back. The attack was repelled. When dawn finally came and the guns fell silent, the men of Albert's platoon took stock of their situation. 7 dead, 12 wounded, but they'd held the line. As the adrenaline wore off and exhaustion set in, Corporal Mitchell suddenly remembered Albert. The strange, mechanical way he'd been fighting. The blank expression on his face. Mitchell looked around and spotted Albert sitting on a fire step about 30 feet away, his rifle across his knees, staring at nothing. Mitchell walked over and said Albert's name. No response. He said it louder, still nothing. Finally, Mitchell reached out and touched Albert's shoulder, and that's when the most incredible thing happened. Albert suddenly jerked awake, gasping like a man who'd been underwater. He looked around in complete confusion and panic. His first words were to ask what time it was and whether the attack had started yet. Mitchell just stared at him. The attack, it was over. They'd been fighting for hours. Didn't Albert remember any of it? Albert didn't remember a single thing. The last memory he had was lying down in his dugout around 10 in the evening. Everything after that was a complete blank. Mitchell tried to explain what had happened, how Albert had fought with incredible skill and bravery, how he'd saved William Davies' life. Albert thought Mitchell was playing some kind of cruel joke on him. It wasn't until other soldiers gathered around and confirmed the story, until they showed him his uniform torn to shreds where he'd used it for bandages, until they showed him his rifle with blood on the bayonet, that Albert began to accept that something impossible had occurred. The commanding officer was called, a major named Harrison who'd served in the army for 20 years and thought he'd seen everything. He interviewed Albert, interviewed the other witnesses, examined the evidence. At first, Harrison was skeptical. Soldiers under stress sometimes embellished stories, created legends to help them cope with trauma. But the consistency of the accounts, the physical evidence, and most importantly, Albert's genuine confusion and distress at what he was being told, convinced Harrison that something extraordinary had happened. Harrison ordered the medical officer to examine Albert again. This time, the doctor spent hours testing him, asking questions, checking his reflexes and responses. The doctor's conclusion was both fascinating and terrifying. Albert had experienced what we now call a parasomnia, specifically a condition known as sleep violence or REM behavior disorder combined with extreme stress and sleep deprivation. Basically, Albert's brain had shut down the conscious parts that process awareness and form memories, but the deeper, more primitive parts responsible for survival and learned behaviors remained active. He'd been operating on pure instinct and training, with none of the fear or hesitation that conscious thought creates. The doctor explained it like this. You know how sometimes you can drive home from work and not remember the drive because you were on autopilot? Or how you can walk through your dark house at night without thinking about it because your body knows the layout? That's your unconscious mind taking over routine tasks. Well, Albert had been training for combat for months. Loading a rifle, firing accurately, using a bayonet, administering first aid, all of these had become muscle memory. When his conscious mind shut down from exhaustion, his unconscious mind kept running those programs, kept executing those learned behaviors, without any of the mental interference that fear and self-doubt create. In a way, Albert had become the perfect soldier that night. No fear, no doubt, no hesitation, just pure action and reaction, skills flowing naturally without overthinking. It was both magnificent and deeply disturbing because it raised uncomfortable questions about consciousness and free will. If Albert could do all that without being aware, what did that say about the nature of human decision-making? How much of what we do every day is really us making conscious choices versus our unconscious mind running programs we're barely aware of? The army didn't know what to do with Albert. On one hand, he'd shown extraordinary courage and skill under fire. He deserved recognition. On the other hand, he'd done it all while essentially unconscious, which meant he couldn't be trusted to maintain discipline or follow orders if it happened again. The compromise they reached was both practical and cruel. Albert was mentioned in dispatches for bravery. He received a commendation for saving William Davies' life. But he was also quietly transferred to a supply unit well behind the front lines, where his sleepwalking couldn't put himself or others at risk. Albert lived for another 50 years after the war. He married, had children, worked as a builder in Yorkshire. He rarely talked about his experience at the Somme, partly because he didn't remember most of it, and partly because when he did tell the story, people often didn't believe him. It was too strange, too impossible. But the military records survive. The sworn statements of his comrades survive. And they all tell the same story of one night, when a young soldier fought a battle while walking in his dreams. So what are we to make of this? Was Albert Herring a hero who saved his comrades through supernatural skill, or was he a cautionary tale about what happens when we push human beings past their breaking point? I think the answer is both. He was a hero, no question. He saved lives that night, but he was also a victim of a military system that ground men down until their minds broke and their bodies kept going through sheer force of will and training. The story of Albert Herring forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about war and human nature. It shows us that courage isn't always a conscious choice. Sometimes it's just the body doing what it's been trained to do, even when the mind has checked out. It shows us that the line between sleep and waking, between conscious and unconscious, is more blurred than we like to think. And it shows us the incredible cost of war, not just in lives lost, but in minds fractured, in men pushed so far beyond human limits that they literally stopped being fully conscious and kept fighting anyway. Today, we understand sleep disorders much better than they did in 1916. We know that sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, memory problems, and dangerous behaviors. We know that some people can perform complex tasks while sleepwalking, from cooking meals to driving cars, with no memory of it afterward. We know that the military training creates neural pathways so deep that soldiers can execute complex maneuvers almost unconsciously. But even with all our modern understanding, the story of Albert Herring remains extraordinary because of the extreme circumstances and the life or death stakes involved. What happened that night at the Somme was a perfect storm of factors: extreme sleep deprivation, intense military training, the massive adrenaline dump of combat, and perhaps some unique quality in Albert's own neurology that allowed his unconscious mind to take over so completely. It was a one-in-a-million combination that produced a one-in-a-million event. And thank goodness for that, because the last thing we want is soldiers who fight without being fully conscious of their actions. The ethical implications alone are staggering. But there's also something deeply moving about Albert's story. Here was a man who, even in his deepest sleep, even when his conscious mind had completely shut down, still acted to save his friend. When William Davies fell wounded, some unconscious part of Albert recognized that a comrade was in danger and needed help. No thought, no calculation, no weighing of risks and benefits. Just immediate action driven by bonds of loyalty and training that went deeper than consciousness itself. In a way, it's the purest form of heroism. Not a deliberate choice to be brave, but an instinct so deeply ingrained that even sleep couldn't suppress it. The men who served with Albert never forgot what they saw that night. Corporal Mitchell wrote in his diary that it changed how he thought about courage and consciousness. He wrote that before that night, he'd always assumed bravery was about being afraid and acting anyway. But watching Albert fight without any awareness or fear made him realize that maybe courage is more complicated than that. Maybe it's about training yourself, conditioning yourself, so that when the moment comes, you don't have to think or choose. You just do what needs to be done. William Davies, the man Albert saved, kept in touch with him after the war. They'd meet for a pint at the local pub once a month, two old soldiers who'd shared something that transcended normal human experience. Davies would always buy the first round, his way of saying thank you for a life he would have lost if not for Albert's unconscious heroism. And Albert would always downplay it, would say he didn't remember it so he couldn't really take credit for it. But Davies would shake his head and say that's exactly why it mattered. Albert hadn't saved him for glory or recognition. He'd saved him because at the deepest level of his being, that's who Albert was. A man who'd help a friend in trouble, even in his sleep. There's a final twist to this story that makes it even more poignant. Years after the war, in the 1950s, Albert started having nightmares. Not about the battle he couldn't remember, but about other things he'd seen at the Somme. The friends he'd lost. The horrors he'd witnessed. His mind, which had protected him during the battle by shutting down and operating on autopilot, was now making him relive those traumas in his dreams. He started sleepwalking again, not every night, but often enough that his wife had to lock the bedroom door to keep him safe. The doctors couldn't do much for him. This was decades before PTSD was properly understood or treated. So Albert lived with it, managed it as best he could, another invisible casualty of a war that had ended 40 years earlier but still haunted him every night. When Albert died in 1966 at the age of 73, his family found something in his possessions that explained a lot. It was a small notebook he'd kept hidden for 50 years. In it, he'd written about the one night he couldn't remember. He'd collected statements from the men who'd been there, had them write down what they saw. He'd drawn diagrams of the trench layout. He tried to reconstruct those lost hours, to understand what he'd done when his conscious mind was absent. It was clear from his notes that the experience troubled him deeply. He wrote that it felt like someone else had been in control of his body that night, someone more capable and braver than he'd ever been when fully awake. He wondered if that person was still inside him somewhere, or if it had only existed in that narrow window between sleep and waking, between peace and war. The story of Albert Herring, the soldier who fought a battle while sleepwalking, is more than just an interesting historical curiosity. It's a window into the extremes of human capability and suffering. It shows us what people are capable of when pushed beyond normal limits. It raises profound questions about consciousness, courage, and the nature of heroism. And it reminds us of the terrible cost of war, not just in lives lost, but in minds broken and souls haunted by things they did or witnessed, whether they remember them or not.